31-year-old Mary Catherine Edwards lived in Beaumont, Texas in 1995. She was a respected teacher and had a large circle of friends and a close-knit family. Mary was last seen on the evening of Friday, January 13th of 1995 at the new townhouse she just moved into. Her parents grew concerned the following day when she did not respond to phone calls. They went to her home to check on her welfare, and they found a horrific scene. Mary had been drowned in her own bathroom. She had been handcuffed with her hands behind her back. An autopsy revealed that she had been assaulted as well. Investigators collected male DNA from her body and stored it for future use. For more than 25 years, the case remained unsolved. Then in April of 2020, investigators began using genetic genealogy to help find a suspect. They first found several distant cousins, which led them closer and closer to an arrest. Eventually, the DNA led them to Clayton Bernard Foreman. Foreman and Mary attended the same high school. They were also casual friends. Mary was even a bridesmaid at the wedding of Foreman and his first wife. Investigators also learned that the crime against Mary had similarities to a 1981 assault of one of Foreman's high school classmates. Foreman pleaded guilty to that crime and received 3 years of probation. Foreman was arrested in May of 2021 in Franklin County, Ohio, where he lived and was charged with taking Mary Catherine Edwards' life. On Wednesday, September 22nd of 2021, Foreman was indicted. A date for the trial has not yet been released. 24-year-old Feroza Daganpour was a student at the University of Nebraska in Omaha in 1983. Disappeared from the college campus on August 13th of 1983 after attending her evening classes. Then, a day later, on August 14th, her body was discovered by fishermen under a bridge in Pigeon Creek in nearby Council Bluffs, Iowa. An autopsy would determine that Feroza had been beaten, stabbed in the abdomen, and slashed in the throat. Over the next few months, several agencies worked together to try to find the culprit. Unfortunately, they were unable to, and the case went cold. Then, in 2020, one of Feroza's friends reached out to investigators with the name of a possible suspect in the case. Investigators were quickly able to rule that person out because he had a solid alibi. When they took a new look at the case, though, they saw that detectives who worked on the initial investigation collected several pieces of evidence from the crime scene that might be useful now with advances in DNA technology. The evidence included a bra, underwear, blouse, notebooks, computer printouts, work gloves, prescription glasses, a beer can, and 2 pens. All of these items had been stored at the sheriff's office for nearly 4 decades. Investigators sent the items to the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation Laboratory for DNA testing and learned in March of 2021 that a blood-stained glove found at the scene contained Feroza's DNA and that of a male. They were able to match the unidentified DNA to Bud Leroy Christensen through the National Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, database. Investigators also found Christensen's fingerprints on papers that had been found near the body. Christensen has a long criminal history with many similar crimes that he has committed over the years. On April 30th of 2021, authorities announced that Christensen had been arrested and charged with taking Ferris's life. Crime scene technician Hadley McCavick said during the press conference that the arrest in the case was made possible because of the significant technological advances in DNA analysis in recent decades. Would like to encourage the family and friends of victims to never give up hope and continue to work diligently with law enforcement agencies handling their investigations. Let Feroza's case be an example that it is never too late to seek answers, she said. Feroza's brother and father, who live in London and Iran respectively, were notified that an arrest was made. In late January of 1994, the owner of Bob's Car Wash in Jeanneret, Louisiana, made a gruesome discovery. He was taking out the trash when he found a deceased female baby inside a 55-gallon garbage can behind his business. The local coroner, Dr. James Falterman, did the autopsy. He also delivered the eulogy at the unnamed girl's funeral and addressed the 200-plus mourners. He said that when he saw the infant with her thumb in her mouth, he began to have cold thoughts of anger, of depression and sadness. Dr. Falterman also noted that the girl was alive when she was thrown away, and that she probably lived just a few hours before succumbing to the cold. I couldn't find a sketch of the baby, but she was described as black and female and was named Baby Jane Doe. The acting police chief at the time, Kerry Davis, vowed to find the child's mother. It may not have happened on his watch, and it may have taken 25 years, but authorities say that it finally happened. The child's mother, 50-year-old Sonia Charles of New Iberia, was arrested in September of 2019. The Iberia Parish Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit recently reopened the case after new leads were developed. The department spokesperson, Major Wendell Rayborn, explained that a local cold case group helped bring renewed attention to the case and that new leads were brought to investigators' attention. DNA evidence collected from both Baby Jane Doe and the crime scene was recently re-examined by a local laboratory, which in turn developed a DNA profile. That DNA profile, according to the Sheriff's Department, matched a sample obtained from Sonia Charles. Private investigator Stephen Maynard started the Cold Case Advocacy Group, which shone a new spotlight on this case. It's going to take a long time to heal. Family members know who she is now, he said. Maybe the baby can finally get a name. In May of 2021, a Liberia Parish grand jury indicted 52-year-old Sonia Parrish for taking the life of her newborn daughter. Following the indictment, she was booked into the Iberia Parish jail on a $250,000 bond. Charles faces life in prison without parole if convicted. 45-year-old Susan Tice lived in Toronto, Canada in 1983. She was a mother of 4 children and worked as a social worker. Her body was found in the upstairs bedroom of her recently purchased home on Grace Street on August 17, 1983. She had moved to Toronto from Calgary in July and separated from her husband, who was living in a downtown townhouse. By the time her body was found by a relative, the mail had piled up outside of her home. She had suffered multiple stab wounds to the chest. An autopsy was unable to determine when exactly her life ended. Police admitted that they had few leads on the case. A detective said at the time, "We have no suspect at all." For months later, on December 20th of 1983, 22-year-old Erin Gilmore's body was found in her Toronto apartment. A friend who went to pick her up for a cocktail party found Erin's body. Like Susan Tice, Erin had been stabbed, assaulted, and found in her bedroom. Police canvassed door-to-door to no avail. Erin was an aspiring clothing designer from a wealthy family. Her father, David Gilmore, had been the business partner of tycoon Peter Monk, co-founder of the mining company Barrick Gold. It was Monk's son who found Erin's body. For years, then decades, investigators knew little about what happened to Susan and Erin, except that they suffered a similar fate. In 2008, advances in DNA technology brought a break, confirming through evidence at the scenes that one man was responsible for what happened to both Susan and Erin. But it would take nearly 15 more years and even greater scientific advances to identify who he was. Recently, via a combination of advanced genetic sequencing, forensic genealogy, and traditional police work that's now regularly cracking open decades-old cases, investigators arrested 60-year-old Joseph George Sutherland from Moosonee, Ontario, Canada, in connection with Susan and Erin's cases. Moosonee is a remote community far removed from the slayings that police allege he committed nearly 40 years ago. Detective Sergeant Stephen Smith, the lead Toronto police investigator, speculated that Sutherland had been waiting for the knock to come at the door. Smith told reporters that a second phase of the investigation must now begin. A painstaking review of Sutherland's whereabouts in the intervening 39 years. Obviously, we're going to look into every possible connection to any possible case throughout Ontario to ensure that he isn't responsible for any other offenses, Smith said. The cases are just the latest advances through genetic genealogy, a cutting-edge process that has breathed new life into old cases all but declared unsolvable. Detective Smith said that the scientific advances were the only way the cases were ever going to be solved. Joseph Sutherland was 22 years old at the time that he took the lives of Susan and Erin. He was never a suspect in the case, nor had he ever been interviewed. He had been living in Toronto at the time, but later moved to Moosonee. A Facebook profile for Sutherland reveals a person going about a seemingly normal life, enjoying the outdoors and requesting recommendations for services like an electrician, while griping with everyday problems. Retired Toronto detective Mark Mendelson said that investigators can also turn to classic techniques to identify any other crimes they believe Sutherland may be responsible for, including photo lineups. Previous cases had eyewitnesses as well as fingerprint analysis. Now that Sutherland's fingerprints will be in a centralized system known as AFIS. He said it's also entirely possible that Sutherland never went on to commit other violent acts. But he said there isn't enough statistical data about serial criminals to have an informed discussion about it. The former cop said one thing is certain. It's a clear example of, ain't science wonderful? Sutherland is scheduled to appear in court soon in 2023. One of Aaron Gilmore's brothers, Sean McCowan, had this to say about the arrest. The best call I've ever received. This is a day that I, and we, have been waiting almost an entire lifetime for, McCowan said. For nearly 4 decades, the culprit had been a ghost, said McCowan, adding that his mother, who passed away 2 years ago, never recovered from the loss of her only daughter. She would have been so relieved that there had been an arrest, and so happy that someone will face justice after being anonymous for 39 years, McCowan said. In 1974, Carla Walker was a 17-year-old junior at Western Hills High School in Fort Worth, Texas. Just 4 feet 11 inches, Carla had honey blonde hair that fell below her shoulders. She was dating Rodney McCoy. He was described as a wiry, good-natured kid who was the quarterback of the football team. Rodney and Carla talked about enrolling together at Texas Tech University. She told her closest friends that she had no doubt that she and Rodney would someday marry and start a family. The evening of February 16th of 1974, Rodney arrived at the Walkers' home in Benbrook in far west Fort Worth to take Carla to the school's Valentine Day dance. When the event ended around 11:30, Rodney invited another couple to cruise Camp Bowie Boulevard and the Benbrook traffic circle with him and Carla. They stopped at a couple of teen hangouts, Mr. Quick Hamburgers and Taco Bell. After dropping off the others, Rodney and Carla drove to a nearby bowling alley, Brunswick Ridgely Bowl, where Carla used the restroom. Not long after Carla climbed in the car, the passenger door flew open. Rodney caught a glimpse of a tall man with short brown hair. He began bludgeoning Rodney over the head with the butt of a pistol. At some point, the gun's magazine clip dislodged and fell into the parking lot. The man grabbed Carla. Rodney, barely conscious, heard him say, "You're coming with me, aren't you, sweetie?" "Rodney, go get my dad," Carla said. "Go get my dad." Rodney came to the driver's seat sometime around 1 a.m. He sped to the Walkers' home, which was less than a mile away. He drove up over the curb onto the front lawn and slammed on the brakes. Carla's parents, Leighton and Doris, were still awake playing dominoes in the dining room with relatives. Carla's little brother Jim, who was 12 years old, and her elder sister Cindy, who was 18, were in the living room watching television. They heard someone banging at the front door and were stunned to see Rodney, blood dripping down his face. He was frantic. "Mr. Walker, they've got her," he shouted. "They're gonna hurt her bad." Leighton, a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel, grabbed his pistol and raced to the bowling alley. Doris dialed the operator on the family's rotary phone and asked to be connected to the police. Searching the parking lot, they found Carla's purse along with the magazine clip that had been ejected from the assailant's weapon. Other cops drove the surrounding streets in squad cars, scanning for any sign of Carla. After the sun rose, more joined the hunt. Peering through binoculars, a few circled the city in helicopters. When classes resumed on Monday morning, detectives visited Western Hills High. They studied contact sheets of photos taken at the dance looking for anyone who seemed out of place. They stopped kids in the hallways asking if they knew anyone who would want to hurt Carla. On February 20th of 1974, 4 days after Carla's disappearance, 2 of the officers assigned to look for her were driving along a remote 2-lane road near Benbrook Lake about 5 miles southwest of the bowling alley. They spotted a culvert and a concrete tunnel built to let water flow beneath the road and pulled over to peer inside. They saw a young woman lying on her back. Her face and neck were covered with scratches and deep bruises. It was Carla. It appeared that she had been strangled because there were no ligature marks around her neck. Investigators believed that the culprit had choked her using his hands. News of what happened to Carla covered almost the entire front page of the Star-Telegram. Her funeral, which was held at the Western Hills Church of Christ, was attended by more than 1,250 mourners, far more than the small sanctuary could hold. Fort Worth officials formed a task force of detectives from the area's police departments. The group didn't have much to investigate. No fingerprints had been identified on Carla's body or clothing. The blood on her dress had come from Rodney's head wounds. Traces of bodily fluid had been found, but the technology did not yet exist to identify a person from their DNA. And in that era, there were no surveillance cameras in parking lots and no license plate readers on the sides of the highways. The group did set up a 24-hour telephone tip line. At the downtown police headquarters, officers sat behind metal desks, sipping lukewarm coffee and listening to citizens pass on the names of men they believed were responsible. The detectives were told by various callers that Carla's life was taken by a pair of marijuana dealers, by a carnival worker at the Fort Worth Stock Show and Rodeo, and by a quiet young man who often bowled alone at the alley where Carla had been kidnapped. They heard stories about a boy who had supposedly gotten into an argument with Rodney at Mr. Quick Hamburger's the night before the dance. The detectives also hired a hypnotist to try to draw more details out of Rodney, who suffered a head injury during the incident. But the most significant memory he managed to recall was that Carla's kidnapper had been wearing a brown or tan cowboy hat. When the hypnotist snapped his fingers and Rodney awoke, he burst into tears. He was all torn up inside, tormented that he couldn't save his girlfriend. During one meeting, the task force detectives discussed another unsolved case that had taken place on February 7th of 1973, almost exactly a year before Carla's. That night, a young woman named Becky Martin did not return home after attending a night class at Tarrant County Junior College's South Campus. Her body was found almost 7 weeks later. It was so decomposed that there was no way to determine the cause. The medical examiner said Becky could have been stabbed or strangled or even shot through the stomach. What most intrigued the detectives about Becky's case was where her body had been found, in a culvert just outside the city limits. The two girls in two culverts, a year apart. It just seemed too coincidental for investigators. Although they said nothing publicly, the investigators began looking for a serial offender. By March, a month after Carla's life was taken, all the task force had to go on was one small lead. The detectives learned that the magazine clip found in the bowling alley parking lot belonged to a newer Model 22 Ruger handgun. They asked the federal government's Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms to provide them with the names of anyone living in Fort Worth who had purchased that model. The ATF came up with a list of a couple dozen people, and the task force set out to interview each one of them. One man on the list was 31-year-old truck driver named Glenn McCurley. McCurley was raised in West Texas, the eldest of 3 boys. When he was a teenager, his parents sent him to the Westview's boys' home in southwestern Oklahoma. Westview, which is sponsored by the Churches of Christ, promotes itself as a place for those who are deprived due to sickness in their family, boys experiencing significant problems in living with their family, boys needing supervision, and delinquent boys, those who have violated the law but who are not in need of treatment or detention, and abandoned, abused, or neglected boys. It's not clear why McCurley was sent to the home, or precisely how long he was there, but his stay clearly wasn't transformative. By February of 1961, he had left Westview and was in Abilene, Texas, where he stole a car. Then he abandoned that car and stole another one. The State Highway Patrol began to pursue him and shot out one of his tires. He drove the vehicle onto a vacant lot and attempted to escape on foot, but was quickly captured. In court, McCurley pleaded guilty and received a 2-year sentence. He was released early in the spring of 1962 when he was 19. He eventually moved to Midland, where he met a blonde high school student named Judy Watson. On February 16th of 1963, McCurley married Judy in a Baptist church. The young couple moved into a small rental home. McCurley eventually got a job as a truck driver for the U.S. Postal Service with a route to Dallas, Fort Worth area. Judy gave birth to 2 sons, Craig and Roddy. Then, in 1972, McCurley moved his young family to a neighborhood in West Fort Worth. McCurley and Judy enrolled their boys in the public elementary school, and they joined Ridgely West Baptist Church. McCurley got another truck driving job, hauling prefabricated slabs of concrete to construction sites. Judy worked at the church's daycare center. One man who knew McCurley did note a distasteful habit. He'd see a pretty girl and say something like, "Take a look at that." In early March of 1974, two detectives arrived at McCurley's home to interview him about his Ruger .22 pistol. When the officers asked about the gun, McCurley said that it had been stolen 6 weeks earlier from his pickup truck while he was fishing. He then agreed to come to downtown and take a polygraph test, which he passed. The task force promptly eliminated him as a potential suspect. By late spring of 1974, investigators still had little to show for their work. The task force didn't officially disband, but many of the detectives were ordered by their supervisors to return to their other cases. Strangers would occasionally call the Walkers' house, many of them anonymously, claiming they had information about who ended Carla's life. Layton talked to all of them. He took notes and kept them in a metal box the size of a cigar box. He wrote down names and addresses of potential suspects, and he drew circles on maps where he had been told the culprit lived. He was not going to rest until he knew the man responsible was behind bars. When Carla's younger brother Jim turned 16 and got his driver's license, he began spending his free time helping his dad hunt for the perpetrator. Sometimes on the anniversary, he would prowl the parking lot of the Brunswick Ridgely Bowl, looking for anyone suspicious. Jim took boxing lessons at the Panther Boys Club, joined the high school's wrestling and football teams, and went on long runs through his neighborhood. "I wanted to be ready in case I ever came across the culprit," Jim said. "My plan was to overpower him and take him someplace far away, maybe somewhere out in West Texas where no one can hear him scream." On February 19th of 1977, almost precisely 3 years after Carla's body was found, someone came across the body of 25-year-old June Ward, a vocational nurse lying next to a curb in South Fort Worth. June was naked except for a bra strap wrapped around her neck. She'd been strangled and beaten over the head with what the one reporter described as a sharp, heavy object. Detectives who had worked on the Carla Walker task force couldn't help but notice the similarities between the two crimes. Then, on July 9th of 1980, the body of a 19-year-old woman named Denise Hogue, described in the newspaper as an unemployed drifter, was found a few feet from a creek bridge in South Fort Worth. She too had been strangled. 2.5 years later, in February of 1983, the body of Christy Tower, a waitress at the Family Billy Bob's Texas nightclub in the Stockyards, was discovered in a field north of the city. Her hands were bound with electrical wire, and another wire was twisted around her neck. Like the other crimes, Christie's case remained a mystery. Though a few days after her body was found, detectives received a curious bit of news. They learned that Christie's purse had been found in a dumpster behind Cheers, a bar on Champ Bowie Boulevard. Cheers was only a half a mile from the Brunswick Ridgely bowling parking lot, the place where Carla had been kidnapped in February of 1974. Residents were getting more worried about the prospect of a serial offender. Such concerns grew when Catherine Davis, a 23-year-old aspiring model, went missing on September 9th of 1984. Her body was found in a field in far South Fort Worth. About a month later, on October 19th, Marilyn Hartman, a 25-year-old middle school teacher, was found gagged and strangled in her Fort Worth bedroom. Just 3 days after that, Cindy Heller, a 23-year-old Texas Christian University graduate and former beauty contestant, disappeared after last being seen near Hewlin Mall. She was later found strangled in a creek bed on the Texas Christian University campus. The tragedies kept piling up. On November 26th of 1984, Catherine Jackson, another local middle school teacher, was found naked in her bathtub with the water still running. She had been strangled with a cord. 2 weeks after that, Angela Ewer, a 21-year-old part-time model and programmer for an FM rock station, left her fiancé's house in southwest Fort Worth. The following day, her car was found abandoned by a highway in a southern part of the city, and her decomposed remains were eventually discovered in a field north of Fort Worth. On the evening of December 22nd, just days before Christmas, 21-year-old Regina Grover was seen with her boyfriend walking out of the Keg, a restaurant on Camp Bowie. She was found the next day, strangled and drowned in a creek under a bridge in North Fort Worth. Her boyfriend, who was found in his bed at his apartment, had been fatally bludgeoned. Fort Worth women, especially those living in the southwestern part of the city, were panicking. Local media reported on skyrocketing gun and mace sales. When the police department offered a free seminar on self-defense, more than 3,000 attended, most of them women. The police department formed another task force. "We're going to break this thing," Police Chief H.F. Hopkins promised. Detectives questioned every suspect, from ex-cons with long rap sheets to a freelance photographer. The investigation, though, was fruitless. The only welcome news was a lull in crimes. The culprit, if it was one culprit, seemed to have retreated. That was until February 24th of 1986. A passerby came across a woman's unclothed body, partially wrapped in a blanket, lying on a hillside near a park in central Fort Worth. She had been strangled, but the police could not identify her through the usual means, fingerprints or dental records, nor did they receive any reports about a missing woman that might have provided a clue. Another year passed, and then another, and this time it really did appear as if the unknown man committing all these crimes had retreated for good. Carla Walker's little brother Jim had not given up. After graduating from Western Hills High, Jim had attended Sam Houston State University, where he read books on serial offenders and took courses in abnormal psychology so that he could better understand what he described as the criminal mind. After he graduated from college, he moved back to Fort Worth and applied to become an officer with the city's police department. His plan was to get promoted to detective and get his hands on Carla's files and find the man responsible. During a training session at the academy's firing range, however, Jim noticed something was wrong with his eyesight. A doctor later diagnosed him with a congenital eye condition. Forced to drop out of the academy, he went to work in security at a local office of defense contractor General Dynamics. But he continued hunting for the man responsible. After his father passed away in 1987 of a heart attack, Jim dug through the notes in Layton's metal box looking for new leads to pursue. After his mother passed away in 2015, Jim purchased his parents' home and moved into it with his wife. "I wanted to be there in case somebody ever got a conscience at 3 in the morning and showed up to confess," he said. In January of 2019, Detectives Leah Wagner and Officer Jeff Bennett decided to take another look at Carla's case after Jim made a request. Among those they re-interviewed was Carla's then-boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, who had moved to Alaska as soon as he graduated from high school to work on an oil rig, telling his family that he needed to get as far away from Fort Worth as possible. He eventually returned to Texas and was living near Austin when Wagner and Bennett reached him. To try to locate new witnesses, investigators posted a message on the police department's Facebook page. They got a couple dozen responses, including one from a woman who claimed that her ex-husband had grown up in the same neighborhood as Carla and had kept a stash of newspaper articles about her case, which he occasionally reread. A likely sign said the ex-wife that he was responsible. No doubt to the ex-wife's disappointment, the ex-husband was able to prove he'd been out of town the weekend Carla's life was taken. What the detectives needed was physical evidence. And the best physical evidence they could hope to find, of course, was the culprit's DNA. Since Carla lost her life, the technology of DNA identification had not only been developed, but had progressed beyond anyone's expectations. There were now even laboratories that specialized in genealogical mapping, in which technicians use freely accessible databases to link DNA from an unknown person to the DNA of that person's relatives. Fortunately for Wagner, and Carla's dress and other clothing she'd worn the night her life was ended had been carefully packed away in paper bags in the police department's evidence lab, which meant there was a chance that technicians still could turn up a usable sample of DNA. After all these years, however, there was no way of knowing whether the DNA had degraded, which would prevent the technicians from compiling a full genetic profile of the man responsible. Once more, conducting DNA tests on Carlos Close could cost the Fort Worth Police Department as much as $20,000, money that was more likely to go towards active cases. Wagner and Bennett were determined to find at least one good lead, but they knew the odds were against them. Then, their investigation took an unpredictable turn. Vincent Strange was a 40-year-old Fort Worth aerospace technician and true crime buff. In 2017, he created a podcast about unsolved cases in Texas. His first story was going to be about Carla Walker, whose case he had read about while poking around the internet. He interviewed Carla's siblings, Jim and Cindy, as well as a few of her friends. One person who did listen to it was Diane Kuykendall. Diane had gone to school with Carla. Carla always smiled at her in the hallway, even though they didn't really know each other. Diane said it made her feel good and that she wishes that there was some way that she could pay Carla back. Diane decided to fly to Nashville to attend CrimeCon, an annual 3-day true crime convention that most recently attracted some 5,000 people. She brought along 80 copies of a pamphlet she had written about Carla's case. She handed out the pamphlets to the likes of Dateline's Keith Morrison, Fox News' Nancy Grace, and Paul Holes, a retired investigator who works for the Oxygen Network. Paul Holes was intrigued and convinced Oxygen to pay $18,000 to cover the cost of DNA testing on Carla's clothes. At a lab in California, technicians found some intact, untainted bodily fluid were found. From that fluid, they were able to develop a full DNA profile, which they uploaded to CODIS, a nationwide law enforcement database that contains the DNA of millions of criminal offenders. CODIS, however, couldn't find a match. Paul Holes and his producers contacted a Texas lab that also does genealogical mapping, but technicians there had no luck either. David Middleman, CEO of Othram, then got into contact with Paul Holes. He said he was optimistic that his particular DNA identification method, a sophisticated technology that used genome sequencing, could find a match. The morning of July 4th of 2020, David Middleman called Officer Bennett. "We've connected the DNA to a particular family tree," he said. "The last name is McCurley." After some further testing and police work, Middleman and Bennett landed on Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr., who had been living in Fort Worth at the time of Carla's demise. Bennett saw Glenn McCurley Jr. was the truck driver who had told the police back in 1974 that his Ruger 22 had been stolen. Wagner and Bennett did a background check on McCurley, but there was little to learn. As far as they could tell, other than his 1961 criminal conviction for stealing a car when he was 18, he had no encounters with the police. McCurley was no longer driving trucks full-time by then. He took on handyman jobs and did part-time maintenance work at a fitness club. Wagner and Bennett decided to pay him a visit. They arrived unannounced at the McCurley's home. McCurley and his wife Judy politely invited the detectives into the living room and chatted amiably. McCurley talked about his old truck driving gigs. Judy said she had spent 32 years at Ridgely West Baptist Daycare Program, finally retiring in 2004 because of health issues. She also mentioned that her husband suffered from diabetes and that he'd recently had surgery to remove a tumor the size of a quarter on his liver. "We're not ready for this," Judy said, "especially with his cancer." Finally, McCurley asked the detectives, his voice raspy, "What do y'all want to talk about?" "We're going to take you way back," Wagner said. "Back in 1974, y'all were living here at the time, so you may have heard about it. There was a young lady kidnapped from a bowling alley." "I know exactly which one you're talking about," Judy immediately said. Carla Walker. Judy later told detectives she could remember where the Walker family lived on Williams Road. "Kept her room the same way it was," she said. "They kept her car still parked in the driveway for years and years. You'd drive by and see that car parked in the driveway, and it was just absolutely heartbreaking." Detective Wagner said that she and Bennett had reopened the investigation and were contacting those who had been interviewed by police in 1974. "It's a huge case," she said, "and we saw at one point they had talked to you, Mr. McCurley." Wagner asked McCurley if she could take a DNA sample. "It would be the easiest way to eliminate him as a suspect," she explained. McCurley hesitated. Then he took a pen, signed a consent form, and opened his mouth so Wagner could dab the inside of his cheek with a Q-tip. Looking on, Judy told the detectives, "I hope you find out who was responsible. That girl needs to be remembered as someone who mattered." 11 days later, after lab techs verified that the DNA from McCurley's cheek perfectly matched the DNA found on Carla's bra strap, the members of the U.S. Marshals North Texas Fugitive Task Force arrived at his house to arrest him. He was driven downtown to the police department, where he waived his right to have a lawyer present during his interrogation. For several minutes, he sat alone in an interview room. At first, he denied any involvement. He claimed he had never seen Carla Walker before, Finally, he said with tears swelling in his eyes, "Okay, I did do it, I guess." He told the detectives that on the afternoon of February 16th of 1974, he had drunk whiskey and beer for several hours. He said he began driving around and parked in some parking lots. At one point, he drove to the bowling ball place. It seemed as if McCurley was about to confess. Instead, he told the detectives he'd heard a girl screaming in a nearby car. "I went over there to see if I could help. This big guy had her up against the door, jerking her around." McCurley said he opened the front passenger door and gotten into a tussle with the boy. He pushed him off Carla, led her back to his car, and then drove her to another parking lot. She started hugging me, thanking me, and one thing led to another. He claimed that everything that happened between him and Carla was consensual, and he did not know what had happened to her after that. After speaking to his court-appointed attorneys, McCurley pleaded not guilty. His attorneys argued in their court filings that Othram Lab's DNA test was flawed, and that Wagner and Bennett had coerced McCurley into a false confession. The attorneys also portrayed McCurley as feeble. "This man poses no threat to anyone. As far as I can tell, he has led an utterly uneventful life." 9 months later, on June 16th of 2021, the first pretrial hearing open to the public took place. Wearing a green jail-issued jumpsuit, McCurley was pushed into the courtroom in a wheelchair. When the actual trial got underway, a few months later, Carla's boyfriend Rodney testified about the night she vanished. Retired Detective Jim Minter took the stand to talk about the original investigation into Carla's case, and Wagner and Bennett testified about their own police work. Prosecutors D.A. Vignan and Emily Dixon unfolded the powder blue dress Carla had been wearing the night she was abducted and presented it to the jury. They also played 3 hours of the videotaped interview that Wagner and Bennett had conducted with McCurley after his arrest. And then, the prosecutors revealed a surprise piece of evidence: McCurley's .22 Ruger, which he claimed had been stolen. Police had discovered it during a search of his home, hidden away in a compartment above a door. The case, of course, was open and shut. On the third day of the trial, McCurley changed his plea to guilty, and the judge quickly sentenced him to life in prison. In the aftermath of the trial, there were still a lot of questions. Why would Glenn McCurley, a man with no violent criminal record, have committed such a sadistic crime? Was it an impulsive drunken act? Or was McCurley a depraved serial offender who was also responsible for taking the lives of other young Fort Worth women? And if he was a serial offender, why did he suddenly stop in the mid-80s? Did he have a genuine change of heart? Was that even possible? Investigators believe McCurley is responsible for many other crimes, and the investigations are currently ongoing. Rui Pedro Teixeira. This dreadful case unfolded in La Sada, a village located in the northern part of Portugal, a region celebrated for its vineyards, its famous green wine, and its reputation for holding the youngest population in the nation. Situated in the center of the municipality carrying the same designation, this village lies close to the northwestern coast of Portugal, a destination for summer leisure for travelers coming from different parts of Europe. Inside this picturesque village, on January 28, 1987, Rui Pedro Teixeira came into the world. His parents, Filomena and Manuel, praised his energetic and cheerful spirit together with his extraordinary inventiveness and imagination. To summarize, this household, including their youngest daughter Karina, enjoyed a peaceful and fulfilled existence. As a youngster, Rui Pedro was full of vitality. After finishing his regular schoolwork, he took part in lively football games with his cherished cousin, Joe Andre, along with other neighborhood youngsters. His dream was to become a professional goalkeeper, and so he always chose to play in that position. Among the group of boys, another pastime was biking, and he was frequently observed speeding through the village to make sure he attended his daily mathematics lessons on time. Yet one shadow hung over his otherwise tranquil childhood. Rui Pedro struggled with epilepsy. Manuel and Filomena owned a driving school. One day, an ordinary young man called Afonso Diaz came to the school with the intention of securing his driver's license. Filomena quickly realized that Afonso was enduring financial struggles. Famous for her remarkable compassion, she at once looked for ways to help him. At first, she gave him clothes, and as their relationship grew closer, she offered him the chance to work at the school, allowing him to earn additional money. 3 years went by, and due to Filomena's generosity, Afonso became a truck driver at only 22 years of age. The family placed so much trust in Afonso that they depended on him to collect Rui Pedro and Karina from school and bring them safely home. For this, Afonso used his brother's vehicle, a Fiat Uno, while they spent time together each day. An uncommon companionship developed between Afonso and Rui Pedro. The family did not regard it as unusual, particularly since Afonso had a youthful and playful nature, which caused him and Rui Pedro to feel like siblings. Nevertheless, the maternal grandparents regarded their bond with doubt. Manuel, by contrast, worried about Afonso smoking near the boy and thought of him as a poor influence. Fearful of the results of this friendship, Manuel spoke with Filomena about it. But she remained persuaded of Afonso's good intentions and believed he meant no damage. Ultimately, as in every solid marriage, they settled on a compromise, with Filomena consenting to watch over their dealings. On March 4, 1998, close to 2 p.m., Rui Pedro pedaled his bike to his mother's workplace, which was only a few blocks from home, to inform her that Afonso had invited him for a drive in his brother's car. Filomena disliked the idea and instructed him not to go. Instead, she directed him to a nearby field where his friends were waiting to play soccer, stressing the importance of arriving punctually to his 5 p.m. lesson. Although he felt let down at first, Rui Pedro complied. He took off his bicycle helmet and walked toward the soccer field. When he arrived, he met his friends, except for Joa Andre, whose mother had forbidden him from going out. Unexpectedly, a black Fiat Uno, driven by Afonso, entered the field a few minutes later and halted next to Rui Pedro. They exchanged a brief conversation, and afterward, the boy set aside his bicycle helmet, climbed into the car, and waved goodbye to his companions through the passenger side window with a simple motion. Between 5 and 6 that evening, a phone call disrupted the family's calm and marked the beginning of the Teixeira family's darkest days. Rui Pedro's tutor telephoned to tell them that the boy had not appeared at his class. This was extremely uncommon since Rui Pedro had never before missed a lesson. Panic overcame his parents, who feared that a sudden epileptic seizure might have left him unconscious, potentially resulting in serious brain injury if he did not receive immediate medical care. The word spread swiftly around the village, and alarmed residents quickly took action. They formed small search groups to comb the entire area. Soon afterward, they discovered their first lead. A neighbor stated that at around 3 p.m., he had noticed Rui Pedro's bicycle concealed in some bushes close to the soccer field where he had been playing. Manuel and Filomena knew their son deeply. They recognized that his bicycle was precious to him, and he would never abandon it without a valid reason. This convinced them that Rui Pedro might have been taken by force. Without any delay, they hurried to the police station to register his disappearance. After receiving the report, the police began their inquiries by interviewing the 3 boys who had played soccer with Rui Pedro. These companions described how a black vehicle had entered the field to collect their friend, clearly identifying Afonso as the driver. They pointed out that Afonso's conduct had been odd and domineering toward their young peer. At first, the officers distrusted the children's testimonies and opted to dismiss their words. Nevertheless, they relayed the misleading detail to the mother, which fueled her suspicions. Filomena then revealed Rui Pedro's request earlier that afternoon to meet up with his companion. Instantly, everyone's attention was directed at the truck driver, and the police moved forward to inspect his residence. Afonso received the officers willingly, ready to answer what they called routine questions. As the final individual to have seen the boy, his account could reveal vital details. Nevertheless, the truck driver stayed strangely composed and insisted he had not encountered Rui Pedro. His demeanor aroused suspicion among the officers, considering the numerous witness statements they had obtained. As a result, he was brought to the police station for deeper interrogation. Once at the station, Afonso attempted to provide an alibi. He claimed that his brother had requested him to take the car for its yearly inspection, a compulsory requirement in Portugal for vehicles older than 8 years. Yet the records indicated that he had never appeared for the arranged appointment that afternoon. Afonso held on to his version, continuing to reject that the child had entered the vehicle earlier in the day. He only admitted to a short meeting lasting 5 minutes with Rui Pedro before 2 p.m. Later, he alleged that he had driven to a nearby town, about 15 kilometers from Losada, and parked in front of a pharmacy. Afonso declared that he remained in the car for some time before choosing to walk around the city, even noting that he admired the store displays. Once he became weary, he drove to his girlfriend's home, arriving at 6:45 p.m. The woman resided in another village in the area, just 11 minutes distant from Losada. Meanwhile, in the reception area of the police station, Rui Pedro's grandfather and cousin waited nervously, intent on pressing for faster progress in the investigation. When Afonso's questioning ended, the two of them encountered the suspect in the corridors. On seeing him, the grandfather pleaded desperately about his grandson's location and promised anything in return for an answer. Afonso burst into tears and maintained that he had no knowledge of the child's location. Still, he cautioned that if they hoped to find him, it was crucial to shut all borders because he had likely been abducted and taken toward another country. The cousin also challenged Afonso, and even referred to a conversation they had shared with Rui Pedro the previous day. The man's sole reaction was to yell at the boy to keep quiet once and for all. Yet the cousin was undeterred. Instead, he carried on the account with further specifics. Afonso had suggested taking both of them to meet prostitutes, and said that the meeting place would be an empty lot. Following these revelations, a large-scale police search was initiated across the region, involving local inhabitants, firefighters, and even the deployment of bloodhounds to track the scent of the missing boy. The officers believed that the boy might have had a seizure and was unconscious somewhere in the village. Or maybe he had simply wandered far away and couldn't find his way back. In summary, they considered it a case of a search and rescue, ruling out the hypothesis of kidnapping. Rui Pedro's family was outraged by this approach to the case. Due to the extensive dissemination of Rui Pedro's images in the local media, a sex worker recognized his face and contacted the local police. She stated without hesitation that on March 4, 1998, a black car had stopped in front of her on a desolate road. The driver offered her $10 to have sex with the little boy who accompanied him. She asked how old the boy was, and the man replied that he was old enough. The woman took him behind some bushes by the side of the road and looked for a private place where no one could see them. There was no sexual contact. The young boy was deeply terrified, crying without pause and repeating again and again that he wanted to go. Witnessing the child in such a distressed condition, the sex worker could not help but feel pity for him. She spent nearly 15 minutes attempting to console him. She embraced him firmly and reassured him that everything would eventually be all right. Amid his sobbing, he admitted to her that he had been forced to attend that encounter. After leaving the bushes, the boy entered the car, and that was the last moment she saw him. Every indication pointed toward an abduction, yet even with this strong witness account, the police still hesitated to completely accept this explanation. In a desperate appeal, the family urged the authorities to act swiftly, emphasizing that each passing minute could be decisive for the child's survival. The next morning, shortly after the court opened, they succeeded in convincing the public prosecutor's office to request the involvement of the judicial police, a specialized body tasked with investigating major crimes such as murders, kidnappings, organized crime, and terrorism. Within 24 hours of Rui Pedro's last sighting, several judicial police agents arrived in the town. In the days that followed, together with relatives and neighbors, they carefully searched the whole region, suspecting that Rui Pedro might have been abandoned somewhere. The circulation of posters showing the boy's photograph increased, spreading on a national scale, and the entire nation of Portugal was profoundly shaken by the case. The disappearance of the boy ignited a massive feeling of collective grief. People began calling Rui Pedro our boy or our little Pedro. At the same time, the family started receiving a flood of telephone calls, many of which were cruel and upsetting. Some claimed they were holding Rui Pedro, while others offered tips about his location that ultimately led nowhere. The boldest callers even demanded ransom money. One particularly horrifying call featured a child whose voice sounded frighteningly similar to Rua Pedro's. Amid shrieks and sobs, he cried desperately for his mother. Pointing to the difficulty of tracing every call, the police decided not to follow up on any leads that came via telephone. The family's despair deepened, and the dismissal of possibly crucial information for the investigation seemed both incompetent and negligent. In April 1998, 1 month after the disappearance, a new suspicion surfaced. A well-known Portuguese journalist traveled to Disneyland in Paris with his wife and children to prepare a report that would be published in a widely circulated magazine in Portugal. The article included several photographs of him and his family at different attractions in the park. In one of these pictures, a particular image raised serious concerns. In the background, a small child could be seen with a man wearing red. Filomena and Manuel viewed the picture and declared with certainty that it was Rua Pedro. In September of that same year, a major development took place when British police dismantled a pedophile network in an operation called Operation Cathedral. This group mainly functioned online and operated as a database containing thousands of photos and videos of children who had been sexually abused. This operation attracted major public attention because of the unusually vast quantity of pornographic material owned, created, and shared by members of this organization. Alarmingly, authorities uncovered more than 750,000 photographs and 1,800 videos. Out of the 1,263 individuals appearing in the confiscated content, only 17 were recognized. 1 from Argentina, 1 from Chile, 1 from Portugal, 6 from the United Kingdom, and 7 from the United States. Filomena affirmed that Rua Pedro appeared in some of those images, proving that he was still alive, but nothing further. There were no coordinates or indications of his possible whereabouts. The British police speculated that members of the ring had abused him on film and possibly harmed him afterward. Across the following 13 years, the Portuguese public ministry assembled a case against Afonso, who continuously asserted his innocence. The trial commenced in November 2011. The principal testimonies came from Rua Pedro's 3 companions, forming the foundation of the prosecution, while the judge managed to confirm certain aspects presented in court. Several statements were dismissed due to insufficient conclusive proof. In March 2012, Afonso was acquitted. On Rua Pedro's 27th birthday, January 28, 2014, a video appeared that rapidly spread on social media. Various actors voluntarily took part in this campaign. Its purpose was to seek new information concerning Rua Pedro's location, while also displaying the email addresses of the Northern Board of Judicial Police and the Portuguese Association for Missing Children, ensuring that the young man's case would not vanish into obscurity. This campaign carried a broader mission of denouncing child trafficking for sexual exploitation. Returning to the judicial proceedings, Afonso's freedom proved short-lived. Following an appeal filed by Rua Pedro's family in 2014, Porto Court of Appeals issued a new ruling that sentenced him to 3 years in prison. This conviction was for inciting a minor to engage in involuntary sexual relations, but it bore no connection to the kidnapping or to any charges associated with the disappearance itself. Although Afonso's defense attorney lodged an appeal, the Portuguese Supreme Court upheld this second ruling. On October 3, 2014, the decision was ratified, and on March 18, 2015, Afonso was placed under arrest after police issued a warrant. He was released on parole in March 2017, having completed only 2/3 of his term. Afonso persisted in asserting his innocence, insisting he was the victim of a grave miscarriage of justice. 20 years after the disappearance, in 2019, Rua Pedro was officially declared presumed dead. The police concluded their search as no new leads had surfaced since Operation Cathedral, and the case had turned cold. The young man's fate remains an agonizing mystery. Despite the relentless grief and the unhealed wound of not knowing what befell her son, Filomena never gave up. In 2007, she established the Association of Relatives of Missing Children. Rua Pedro's case underscored a dire reality. We are confronted with an extremely serious phenomenon. Each year, 3 million children are abducted across the world. In Portugal alone, more than 60 children and minors remain missing. Moving on to the next case. Lindsay and Hawker in October 2006. Lindsay and Hawker, an intelligent and ambitious young woman, set out on a journey to Japan in search of adventure, cultural discovery, and the opportunity to inspire others through teaching English. What began as a thrilling chapter in her life soon took a tragic and unimaginable turn. Merely 4 months after her arrival, Lindsay went missing after agreeing to meet a man who had asked for private English lessons. Several days later, her body was discovered buried inside a bathtub filled with sand on the balcony of a quiet apartment in Chiba. How could a simple act of kindness result in such a horrific fate? And who was the man responsible for this chilling crime? Born on December 30th, 1984, in Coventry, England, Lindsay and Hawker grew up in a caring and supportive family. Her parents, Bill and Julia Hawker, instilled in her the values of compassion, determination, and a strong desire to explore the world. As the eldest of 3 daughters, Lindsay was a role model for her younger sisters, admired for both her intelligence and her empathetic character. She excelled academically from an early age, especially in the sciences, and studied at King Henry VIII School in Coventry. Her teachers consistently praised her commitment and her eagerness to help classmates, reflecting her kind personality. Beyond her academics, was active in sports and music, demonstrating her lively and well-rounded character. For higher education, Lindsay pursued a biology degree at the University of Leeds, motivated by her passion for studying life and her ambition to make a positive difference. Her time at university was marked by intellectual drive, academic success, and a vibrant social circle. Recognized for her infectious laughter and positive spirit, Lindsay developed lasting friendships and left a deep impact on everyone she met. In 2006, she graduated with first-class honors. While many of her peers chose traditional career paths or further studies, envisioned something different. She longed to experience life outside of England, immersing herself in another culture while contributing to society. Teaching English abroad seemed like the perfect opportunity to fulfill that dream. After thoughtful consideration, Lindsay decided to move to Japan, fascinated by the nation's rich traditions, deep history, and modern advancements. Her family felt mixed emotions about her decision. They were proud of her adventurous spirit, but worried about her being so far away. Nevertheless, they gave her their full support, knowing Lindsay to be independent and capable, ready to embrace the world on her own terms. Before leaving for Japan, Lindsay and Hawker spent precious time with her family and friends, promising to keep in touch and return with stories of her adventures. In October 2006, Lindsay arrived in Japan, filled with excitement and ready for the new chapter in her life. She had secured a teaching role at Nova, then Japan's largest private English conversation school. Well known for its wide branch network and strong reputation for English education, Nova gave Lindsay the chance to teach conversational English to a wide variety of students, from young professionals to retirees eager to learn from a native speaker. From the beginning of her teaching, Lindsay's warmth and enthusiasm made her stand out among her students. Her friendly personality and ability to create a positive, engaging classroom atmosphere set her apart. Despite the demands of her work, Lindsay quickly adjusted to her new surroundings. She settled in Chiba, a suburban area outside Tokyo, where she shared a comfortable apartment with 2 other foreign teachers. The 3 of them grew close, often exploring the city, enjoying meals together, and supporting one another as they adjusted to life in Japan. Lindsay found happiness in her daily routines, often cycling to Chiba Station to commute, which allowed her to enjoy the scenery and reflect on her day. Through phone calls, emails, and Skype, she stayed in regular contact with her family and boyfriend in England, keeping them reassured and sharing her experiences. Yet, unknown to Lindsay, her bright journey was soon headed toward tragedy. For days before her death, Lindsay came across Tatsuya Ichihashi, a 28-year-old Japanese man from Chiba Prefecture, while on her way home from work. Ichihashi, a loner obsessed with fitness and carrying a troubled past, had grown up near Lindsay's neighborhood. Though he had a degree in horticulture, he was unemployed and financially dependent on his wealthy parents. His intimidating appearance, reinforced by frequent gym training and martial arts, added to his menacing presence. Ichihashi approached Lindsay at a train station, claiming he was one of her students. Polite and respectful in appearance, he at first seemed harmless. Lindsay, always kind-hearted and trusting, spoke with him, likely assuming he was simply a friendly local wanting to improve his English. Yet Ichihashi's motives were far darker. After their short conversation, he followed Lindsay as she cycled home, keeping pace on foot while persistently asking personal questions. Although Lindsay may have felt uneasy, her natural courtesy led her to remain polite. When she reached her apartment, she attempted to end the encounter, but Ichihashi pressed further, asking for a glass of water. Reluctant at first, Lindsay eventually let him inside, likely as a cautious act of kindness. She introduced him to her two roommates, possibly to safeguard herself by making others aware of his presence. Once inside, however, the encounter took a grim and unexpected turn. Ichihashi continued to act harmless, even drawing a portrait of Lindsay and signing it with his name, phone number, and email. This odd gesture may have lowered her guard further. As a caring and professional teacher, Lindsay might have viewed it as a chance to help someone sincerely eager to learn English. When Ichihashi said he was interested in private lessons, she agreed to meet him at a nearby cafe 4 days later. Although Nova technically forbade private tutoring, it was common for teachers to offer lessons on the side. The choice of a public and familiar setting likely made Lindsay feel secure. During the meeting, Ichihashi acted normally, reinforcing her impression that he was simply another student wanting to learn. But when the session ended, he claimed he had forgotten money for payment and suggested they go to his nearby apartment to get it. At first reluctant, Lindsay eventually accepted after receiving reassurance. Ichihashi's earlier politeness, along with the casual and public setting, may have lowered her natural caution. Being trusting by nature and not wanting to seem rude, she went along with his request. They left the cafe together and took a taxi to his apartment complex, only a short distance away. Before entering, Lindsay showed caution by asking the driver to wait outside, telling him she would be just a few minutes. Her likely plan was to collect the payment quickly and return. Sadly, those minutes turned into a tragic eternity. After waiting several minutes without seeing her return, the driver assumed she had simply changed her plans and drove off. Unknown to him, Lindsay had already walked into a deadly trap she would never leave. As soon as Lindsay entered Tatsuya Ichihashi's apartment, his demeanor shifted completely. From an apparently polite student, he revealed his true nature as a predator. Without warning, he struck Lindsay on the head, knocking her unconscious. What followed was a nightmarish series of events that displayed his cruelty and calculated intent. He bound her wrists and ankles with plastic ties and gagged her with scarves, preventing her from calling for help or escaping. Over the hours that followed, Ichihashi inflicted severe physical abuse. Lindsay's body later showed heavy bruising, especially on her upper body and face, evidence of a long and violent struggle. At some point during the ordeal, Lindsay regained consciousness and likely tried to resist. However, Ichihashi, being physically stronger and trained in martial arts, quickly subdued her. Forensic evidence confirmed that Lindsay died after Ichihashi strangled her with such force that the cartilage in her neck was broken, a ruthless and deliberate act meant to silence her forever. To hide his crime, Ichihashi resorted to even darker measures. He shaved Lindsay's head, possibly to change her appearance or delay recognition. He then placed her body in a bathtub, filling it with a mixture of sand and compost soil to hasten decomposition. To speed the process further, he sprayed the mixture with a chemical commonly used for compacting and breaking down waste. After the killing, neighbors recalled hearing unusual noises from his apartment, including something heavy being dragged across the floor. Yet no steps were taken in time to avert the tragedy. On March 24, 2007, Lindsay failed to come home after her scheduled private lesson with Ichihashi. Her sudden disappearance, highly unusual for someone normally so responsible and communicative, immediately alarmed her roommates. Lindsay was known for keeping them updated about even small changes to her plans. With no word from her, they tried to reach her by phone, but she did not answer. By the next morning, with still no sign of her, their fears deepened. They remembered she had gone to meet a student and thought of the sketch Ichihashi had drawn of her, along with his details. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, they reported her missing to Nova, the school where she worked. Nova contacted the police, and an investigation was quickly launched. Using the information from Lindsay's roommates, including the drawing, Ichihashi's name, and his contact details, police traced him to his apartment in Ichikawa, Chiba Prefecture. Officers went to the location on March 26th, just 2 days after Lindsay was last seen. On arrival, they noticed the curtains drawn and no obvious signs of movement inside. Though the apartment appeared still, were subtle hints that someone was present. The police refrained from knocking, as they required a warrant or sufficient cause to enter. Instead, they began monitoring the apartment while awaiting proper authorization and backup. Meanwhile, Lindsay's roommates, along with her family back in England, endured increasing anguish. The uncertainty became nearly unbearable. Her father, Bill Hawker, would later recall the torment of waiting, holding on to hope without knowing the worst had already happened. At about 5:40 p.m. on March 26th, the case shifted dramatically. Officers watching the apartment noticed movement and faint noises suggesting someone was inside. Deciding to act, they moved forward cautiously. Before they could proceed further, the door suddenly opened and Tatsuya Ichihashi emerged barefoot, carrying a rucksack. On spotting the police, he instantly grasped the situation and fled. One officer managed to seize his bag, but Ichihashi slipped free and dashed barefoot down the stairs. Despite their chase, he eluded capture, leaping several flights of stairs and sprinting into the streets. Lacking proper communication tools, the officers struggled to coordinate the pursuit. By the time reinforcements arrived, Ichihashi had vanished into the surrounding neighborhood. The abandoned rucksack contained only gym clothes and personal effects, offering no immediate clues to aid the search. Determined, the police initiated a wide manhunt and circulated wanted posters bearing his photograph. Following his escape, police entered the apartment and uncovered a horrifying scene. On the balcony, concealed in a bathtub filled with sand and compost soil, lay the body of Lindsay and Hawker. The tub had been moved outside, and the soil mixture appeared intended to hasten decomposition. Her remains showed clear evidence of the violent assault she endured. Her wrists and ankles were bound, her face was badly bruised, and her belongings, including her purse and clothing, were scattered around the apartment, confirming her identity. The grim discovery shocked both Japan and the United Kingdom, with news of the brutal crime spreading rapidly, fueling intense media coverage and widespread outrage. The Hawker family, waiting anxiously for updates, was heartbroken when their worst fears were confirmed. News of Ichihashi's escape spread rapidly, sparking outrage and fear. Many questioned how he had managed to slip away despite being surrounded by multiple officers. In the aftermath of his escape, the police launched a nationwide manhunt. Ichihashi was added to Japan's most wanted list, with his face displayed on posters, television broadcasts, and news reports across the nation. Authorities established checkpoints, stepped up patrols, and pursued numerous reported sightings, yet Ichihashi remained out of reach. As weeks turned into months, the trail went cold. Despite extensive efforts and countless reports, he remained free for more than 2 years. By early 2008, frustration intensified among both the public and the police as Ichihashi continued to evade capture. He seemed to vanish into obscurity, moving constantly without leaving a trace. Rumors and unconfirmed sightings only muddled the search further. In response, the Japanese National Police Agency raised the reward for his capture from 1 million yen to 10 million yen, reigniting public interest in the case. Posters displaying his altered appearance and the likelihood of disguises were placed in cities, train stations, and public areas. While on the run, Ichihashi underwent multiple cosmetic surgeries to change his facial features. He visited clinics under false names and even crudely operated on his own lips to thin them. Though living an unstable, itinerant life, he managed to secure work at a construction site in Osaka, earning barely enough to survive. Colleagues later recalled him as a loner who seldom interacted with others. In October 2009, he made a critical error. Seeking another cosmetic procedure, he visited a clinic in Nagoya. The staff, noticing his resemblance to the wanted posters, quietly alerted the police and provided vital information. Acting on this lead, authorities moved quickly. On November 10, 2009, Ichihashi was spotted at a ferry terminal in Osaka, attempting to board a vessel bound for Okinawa. Officers closed in and finally captured him, bringing an end to his 2.5-year flight. His arrest brought a sense of relief to Lindsay's family and the public, though during the initial interrogations Ichihashi refused to speak. His lawyers claimed he had been threatened with the death penalty if he did not cooperate, which they argued explained his silence. As the inquiry advanced, he eventually admitted involvement in Lindsay's death, but insisted it was accidental, claiming he had only tried to stop her from screaming. The trial of Tatsuya Ichihashi began in July 2011 and drew intense media scrutiny. Prosecutors presented a strong case highlighting the brutality of the crime and his calculated attempts to avoid arrest. They demanded the maximum sentence, emphasizing the horrific nature of the murder. Lindsay's family attended, seeking justice, and her father, Bill Hawker, delivered an emotional plea urging the court to impose the harshest penalty. The defense countered that Ichihashi expressed remorse and could be rehabilitated. On July 21, 2011, the Chiba District Court delivered its ruling. Tatsuya Ichihashi was convicted of rape and murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. While the court recognized the gravity of the crime, it cited his lack of prior convictions and apparent remorse as reasons for not imposing the death penalty. The Hawker family expressed their disappointment, having hoped for a more severe punishment, though they found some comfort in knowing he would remain in prison for life. In the years after the trial, Lindsay's parents dedicated themselves to preserving her memory. They established a foundation to support young people aspiring to study and work abroad, ensuring Lindsay's legacy lived on in the ambitions of others. The case also prompted wider conversations about the safety of foreign workers in Japan, especially women. In response, Nova and other language schools introduced stricter safety protocols to prevent future tragedies. Meanwhile, Ichihashi remains incarcerated at Nagano Prison. In 2011, he authored a book titled Until I Was Arrested, recounting his years as a fugitive. He offered the royalties to the Hacker family, but they refused, stating that no financial sum could ever atone for his crime. Moving on to the next case. Jessica Gutierrez, affectionately called Jessie by her family, was born on December 3, 1981, in the United States. She was the youngest of 4 siblings. The family resided in a humble mobile home situated in a rural part of South Carolina. In 1983, their calm life was disrupted when Jessica's parents divorced. The children remained in the full custody of their mother, Deborah, while their father, David Gutierrez, relocated to Mexico, living a transient lifestyle between there and California. After the divorce, Deborah worked tirelessly, securing a position at the United States Postal Service to provide for her children, ensuring their well-being despite the difficulties of raising 4 children alone. By June 1986, Deborah had become involved with a man whose behavior grew increasingly controlling and troubling, worsened further by his escalating alcohol use. Eventually, his conduct became intolerable, and Deborah forced him out of her life and home. Yet the sense of relief was fleeting, as her life soon descended into deeper turmoil. On June 5, 1986, what began as a seemingly ordinary early summer day unfolded in South Carolina. The weather was warm, with temperatures nearing 30 degrees Celsius and scattered clouds filling the sky. The family spent the day enjoying outdoor activities and strengthening their bond. That evening, Deborah prepared sandwiches for dinner and painted Jessica's nails before putting the children to bed. Keeping with her usual routine, Jessica asked to sleep in her mother's bed, and Deborah agreed. Later that night, when Jessica's older brother awoke feeling unwell and in pain, Deborah allowed him to take her bed, moving Jessica instead to the room at the end of the hallway, where she slept beside her sister Becky. The next morning, Deborah awoke to unsettling signs that marked the start of her nightmare. The front door was left open. The family dog roamed nervously, and a set of curtains lay on the floor, with the mosquito nets seemingly torn away. Jessica was nowhere to be found. Her absence was made more haunting when Becky mentioned that a man with a magic hat and a beard had taken her. Panic surged through Deborah as she searched every possible hiding place, hoping Jessica was only playing. When those efforts failed, she frantically combed the area around the home before finally reporting Jessica missing at 9 a.m. The investigations carried out by the Lexington County Sheriff's Department revealed no evidence of a struggle and nothing missing from the home, except for papers scattered across the bedroom floor. Investigators speculated that a kidnapper had entered through the back window, abducted Jessica without waking her, and exited through the front door. Search operations extended into the nearby woods and abandoned buildings in the rural community of Red Bank, which was even more isolated in 1986. Speculation persisted, along with Becky's unwavering account of the man with the magic hat, which continued to haunt the family. As they pursued truth and justice under such grim circumstances, authorities searched countless wooded areas and small streams and ponds in hopes of locating Jessica. Off-road vehicles were deployed to cover large tracts of land, and the sheriff's department dispatched a plane to fly over the region in search of any trace of the girl. Yet despite these efforts, no search produced results. Deborah was brought to the sheriff's department for questioning about the events of the previous 24 hours. She maintained that she had no idea what had happened to Jessica, but was certain of who was responsible. She accused her ex-boyfriend of taking Jessica, though he denied involvement. Investigators also examined the possibility of Jessica's father being involved, though he was in California at the time. Neither man was charged. By June 7th, the FBI and South Carolina law enforcement agencies had joined the search, issuing bulletins nationwide. This was a decade before the Amber Alert system and long before the Internet age. At that time, communication between departments was often slow and cumbersome. The sheriff's department placed a tap on Deborah's ex-boyfriend's phone to monitor all incoming and outgoing calls in case a ransom demand was made. Police confirmed to reporters that they believed Jessica had been abducted from the mobile home and had not wandered away on her own. Weeks into the investigation, detectives were left with only one physical clue: a fresh fingerprint discovered on the open back window, believed to be the point of entry on June 5th. The print was sent to the FBI, but no matches were found. In September 1986, the lead sheriff announced that they had identified a suspect, but insufficient evidence prevented charges. The suspect had failed a polygraph test, but since such results were inadmissible in court, it was not enough to warrant an arrest. In the years that followed, only faint glimmers of hope emerged. In 1987, police in Kansas contacted the Lexington County Sheriff's Department, reporting that they had located a girl resembling Jessica. Deborah immediately flew to Kansas, clinging to the hope of seeing her daughter again. But it was not Jessica. Heartbroken, Deborah returned to South Carolina, determined to keep her daughter's case alive. Tensions soon grew between her and the sheriff, as they often clashed and argued over the investigation's direction. Frustrated, Deborah resolved to carry out her own investigation while keeping Jessica's disappearance in the public eye. By June 1989, she revealed to the state newspaper that she had discovered fibers in an abandoned car linked to a family friend, who was at that time serving a sentence in North Carolina for assault. This marked a major revelation. 2 years earlier, Deborah had also received a letter from a North Carolina inmate claiming that his cellmate had confessed to abducting and killing a 4-year-old child in 1986. That cellmate, Thomas McDowell, was a registered sex offender who had lived in Lexington County during Jessica's disappearance and was personally acquainted with the Gutierrez family. According to the inmate, Thomas had confessed that he killed Jessica because she recognized him, further admitting he had disposed of her body in a landfill. He also claimed to have worn a tall cowboy hat and a beard at the time of the abduction. Thomas's cellmate not only informed Deborah, but also contacted police with the same account. This development prompted investigators to thoroughly interrogate Thomas, who expressed a willingness to provide them with every detail of the crime. However, he demanded immunity in return. Naturally, this was not an agreement the state was prepared to make. So Thomas remained imprisoned in North Carolina, and Jessica's case remained unresolved. Deborah's frustration and anger only deepened. In 1989, she told the state newspaper that it felt as though victims had no rights and that the system was failing families like hers. She was especially outraged that Thomas faced no charges, even after admitting to the crime and providing details that aligned with the events of June 5th. The most shocking development came when Thomas's fingerprints were taken and found to match the fingerprint recovered from the Gutierrez family's back window. In 2007, 21 years after Jessica's disappearance, Deborah openly criticized the Lexington County Sheriff's Department, accusing them of mishandling her daughter's case. She admitted that for years she had lived in fear of what might happen if she contradicted the sheriff, a powerful figure in South Carolina. But after more than 2 decades, she wanted progress and understood that gaining media attention was the only way forward. Local news outlets obtained access to a recorded telephone conversation between Deborah and the sheriff from June 1986, only days after Jessica vanished. The recording made by the department's wiretapping unit captured Deborah arguing with the sheriff, pressing him for answers while he was withdrawing investigators from the search. The sheriff's response was dismissive. He told her he would provide answers when he had them, then threatened to pull all his agents off the case and send them home if she continued to interfere. Deborah was outraged by his words, which she interpreted as a threat to her daughter's case. She countered by asking him what the citizens who had elected him would think if he abandoned Jessica. He coldly replied that they could elect him or not. It made no difference to him. When the transcript was made public in 2007, the sheriff explained that Deborah had accused him of favoritism and mishandling the investigation, remarks that had hurt his feelings. Deborah, meanwhile, voiced her frustration with the prosecutor, revealing that she had spent years attempting to get other agencies to assume control of the case, only to be blocked each time. That same year, the case was reviewed by the prosecutor, but no action was taken against any suspects. He explained that most of the available evidence was inadmissible and what little remained could be explained away or was overshadowed by reasonable doubt. He added that without a body, the state would require significantly stronger evidence to pursue a conviction. Afterward, the case slipped once more into obscurity, but the key figures connected to it began making headlines of their own. In 2014, Sheriff James Metz was indicted in federal court on 10 counts of bribery and wire fraud, ultimately sentenced to 12 months in prison. In 2016, prosecutor Donnie Myers was arrested for driving under the influence after crashing his vehicle into a utility pole and leaving the scene. He was fined $1,000 and retired from public service the following year, in 2017. In 2021, 35 years after Jessica's disappearance, the case drew renewed attention. Sheriff Jacob, elected following James Metz's imprisonment, announced that the county would partner with the FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team to re-examine the case. In January 2022, a long-awaited breakthrough finally arrived. Police arrested 61-year-old Thomas Eric McDowell in connection with Jessica's abduction. McDowell, whom Jessica's mother had always suspected, had lived in Lexington County in 1986 and had long been considered a person of interest, though never fully pursued. He was taken into custody at his home and placed in the county detention center. Following the arrest, McDowell was formally charged with murder, kidnapping, and first-degree burglary in relation to Jessica Gutierrez's disappearance and presumed death. According to the arrest warrant obtained by media outlets, investigators tied him to the crime through a fingerprint recovered inside the Gutierrez home. Officials did not specify where the fingerprint was discovered when it was conclusively linked to McDowell. However, Deborah had known for years about its existence, recalling it was found on a window she cleaned nightly. To her, it was undeniable proof, as only Jessica's abductor could have left it behind. The warrant further noted that McDowell had been picked out in a photo lineup, and that evidence indicated he had admitted to others that he had kidnapped and killed Jessica. The reinvestigation in 2021 saw FBI special agents and state prosecutors return to the area. With assistance from South Carolina law enforcement, they interviewed more than 125 people, combed through over 3,500 pages of case records, and enlisted the resources of 10 FBI field offices nationwide. In their official statement, Authorities credited the arrest to decades of persistent work by local, state, and federal investigators, along with the tireless commitment of community members who refused to let Jessica's memory fade. Though Jessica's body has never been found, her family and law enforcement hold on to the hope that this time justice may finally be within reach. The suspect was expected to cooperate with authorities by clarifying the facts and revealing the location of the little girl. Meanwhile, Jessica's mother, Deborah Gutierrez, remains alive, though decades of unanswered questions have severely impacted her mental health. This time, it was Jessica's sister who spoke publicly after learning of the arrest. She admitted that her family never believed this day would arrive. She emphasized that her mother had fought relentlessly for 36 years to achieve justice for Jessica, praying not only for a conviction, but also for the death penalty. Speaking on behalf of the family, she expressed deep gratitude to everyone who had contributed to the arrest of the man she described as an evil monster. In stark contrast, Thomas's neighbors characterized him as a quiet, reserved man who transported his work tools in a van and never appeared violent. The family and the community now await the trial, hoping for long-awaited answers. For the moment, however, Thomas has not confessed to the crime nor revealed what happened to Jessica. Moving on to the next case. Geronta and Brianna at around 12:30 a.m. on August 30th, 2014. In Decatur, Georgia, Calvin Reddick informed the police that his stepson, Geronta Brown, 24, along with his fiancée Brianna Brooks, who was 7 months pregnant, had been taken from his home. The bodies were later discovered, executed by being shot in the backs of their heads. The scene of the crime revealed how terrifying their final moments had been. There appeared to be more and more individuals who might have been involved, which made the case increasingly complex. It grew darker as time went on. Although the police rushed to Calvin Reddick's residence, the perpetrators had already escaped. More than 5 hours had passed since the initial 911 call when another frightening call came through. When officers arrived at the murder scene, they discovered that both Geronta and Brianna had been shot in the backs of their heads at close range, like victims facing execution. Their hands had also been tied behind their backs. Brianna was found barely clinging to life and transported to the hospital, but it was too late to rescue Geronta. Investigators searched the scene thoroughly for evidence and uncovered something significant. They recovered a 9mm bullet and a matching shell casing near the bodies. As the homicide inquiry progressed, Calvin, Geronta's stepfather, explained to officers that the abductors had phoned him multiple times following the kidnapping and had demanded $150,000 in order to secure the girl's safe return. These ransom calls turned into a crucial lead that directed detectives toward the culprits. Investigators obtained Calvin's phone records and traced the number used for the cash demand. They contacted the cell provider, which identified who was placing the ransom calls, though uncertainty remained over the name Tom Lewis. Because of this, detectives had to revise their plan to capture the offenders. However, before police could act on their adjusted plan, they received an extremely important call from Geronta's sister, who revealed shocking information regarding Calvin, his stepfather. According to her, Calvin was solely responsible for what had occurred, which led police to suspect he may have orchestrated the entire crime. Shortly thereafter, detectives summoned Calvin for questioning to confirm their suspicions. Calvin remained remarkably calm and composed while being interrogated, and he willingly agreed to share his version of events. Calvin stated that it all began that dreadful night when Brianna, Geronta, and her daughter went out to get food. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now let's move on with the video. Geronta and Brianna were in danger, but no one was able to save them. The masked men, who were dressed as FBI agents, then came to Calvin's door and knocked. Calvin explained that when he refused to open the door, they drove off in the van with Geronta and Brianna. Yet that was not the end of the situation. A few minutes later, the intruders phoned and demanded ransom money. The kidnappers instructed him over the phone not to involve the police, but when they discovered he had already contacted them, they became enraged and threatened to kill Brianna and Geronta if the calls continued. The investigators paid close attention to one part of his account as they listened. The criminals demanded a ransom that amounted to a very large sum. Why were the kidnappers so confident that Calvin could afford to pay such a substantial amount of money? The detectives were dissatisfied with Calvin's explanation, so they pressed him further for details. The officers did not receive any valuable information from Calvin about the offenders, leaving them uncertain whether he had played any role in the incident. By that point, however, investigators had obtained the phone records of the ransom caller. After analyzing them, they discovered that the suspect had called a specific number 88 times in the 7 days preceding the crime. They suspected there was a strong possibility that the woman who owned the number might help lead them to the actual culprits. They tracked the woman down and interrogated her to learn how she was linked to the suspect. Shockingly, the woman immediately blurted out an unusual nickname as soon as the detective mentioned the number, just E. She then explained how she had come to know E. She regarded E merely as a casual fling, but investigators had to press harder and request additional information. They asked her to provide a detailed description of E's appearance, and she agreed to help them identify his real name. At that point, the officers were unaware that she was concealing a terrible secret. But the officers kept searching for E by dialing numbers from the phone records. They worked tirelessly for hours before finally coming across a solid lead. Similar to the previous woman, the man on the line did not know much about the suspect apart from his name, E. However, he promised he would call back if he learned anything else. While waiting for additional leads, the agent's primary objective was to track down E and uncover his true identity. They hoped Brianna might provide clues, but as time passed, that possibility seemed to fade. Her condition remained extremely critical. 3 days later, devastating news arrived. Brianna's health was not improving, so her family decided to remove her from life support. Nevertheless, Brianna's baby daughter was saved by the doctors. The physicians explained that the girl would grow up to live a normal life and would not suffer complications that might have ended her life despite being born prematurely. With Brianna's death, the case became a double homicide. As matters deteriorated, investigators shifted their focus to the man from E's phone records. He had told them that he would try to learn more about E's location and call immediately, but he had not contacted them in over 3 days. Detectives re-examined his phone records to determine how many times his number appeared. What they uncovered was alarming. In fact, he had called E after officers first asked for his assistance, yet he chose not to inform them about it. That was not even the most disturbing part. Investigators scrutinized E's phone history and discovered that she had spoken with this man merely 2 hours before Brianna and Geronta were abducted. Police became convinced that this man was concealing information that they needed to uncover what it was. Soon they also managed to obtain his phone records and learned that the man was Andre Gates, 38 years old. The police searched Andre's name in their system and discovered he had a criminal past, was arrested on November 24, 1990, and had served 24 years in prison for killing 2 individuals. He had actually been released only 7 months earlier and was currently on probation. When detectives reviewed the homicide report for Andre, they noted that he had been committing a series of apartment robberies. Fueled by adrenaline, he fired shots into one unit, killing a 39-year-old woman and her 6-month-old infant. With this knowledge, Andre became a prime suspect in the case. Detectives needed to bring him in for questioning. However, they were forced to adjust their plans before that could take place. As of 9 days after Brianna and Geronta were abducted, the case was being reported by major news networks was drawing a great deal of attention. During this period, agents received numerous tips, but one tip stood out and required their immediate focus. A woman contacted the homicide division to report that one of her close friends had received a message likely connected to Brianna and Geronta's kidnapping and murder. The police promptly went to speak with the man who had gotten this message. Detectives learned that someone had mistakenly called him 30 minutes after Brianna and Geronta were taken and had left a 3-minute voicemail. Yet that was not the only revelation. What the man next told investigators left them completely stunned. Detectives became convinced that Andre was tied to the abduction of Brianna and Geronta, even though they did not know for certain that the message came from him. The voicemail was taken back by detectives to be analyzed further at headquarters. After listening carefully to every word on the voicemail, the agents were horrified, imagining how terrified Brianna and Geronta must have been that awful night. But there was another detail in the message that especially caught their attention. They heard a voice that sounded eerily similar to someone already familiar to them. The voices of Brianna and Geronta were not the only ones that stood out. The police quickly recognized who the other woman was. It was the same woman whose voice they had heard before, the very one who had first told them about E. This confirmed to the agents that they were moving in the right direction and getting closer to solving the double homicide. Yet a few missing pieces of the puzzle still remained. Investigators eventually contacted Andre and arranged a meeting with him to gather further information. Detectives devised a strategy before Andre arrived. They did not want to confront him about the voicemail immediately. First, they wanted to see how much Andre was willing to reveal on his own. From the start of the questioning, Andre appeared defensive. His claim was that he had been at home with his wife the night the abductions occurred. Because Andre was questioned extensively, a new name entered the picture: Fathead. Andre admitted that he used to spend time with a man known by that nickname, dropping fragments of information. Andre was making the investigation extremely difficult for officers. Detectives realized they could not make progress with him stonewalling this way. It was time to play their wild card. Andre seemed unaware of what was happening around him. His behavior suggested he did not grasp what detectives were actually implying. Detectives realized the interrogation was leading nowhere because Andre's behavior remained unchanged. They decided to step out of the room, but they were not leaving empty-handed. During the questioning, they had noticed something that did not sit right. Investigators believed that one of the voices on the voicemail sounded very much like Andre, but they required solid evidence to prove it, as well as confirmation that the voicemail had been recorded during Brianna and Geronta's abduction. Since there was insufficient proof to obtain a warrant for his arrest, Andre had to be released. While keeping a close watch on him, detectives worked to identify Fathead and determine how to track him down. They were convinced that locating Fathead would ultimately lead them to E. At that very moment, another officer overheard the agents discussing Fathead. He approached them and revealed something completely unexpected. The officer explained that he was already working on a case involving Fathead, and that there was even an active murder warrant issued against him. He further stated that Fathead was a 40-year-old man whose real name was Richard Wilson. When detectives searched the database, they found that Fathead had a long criminal history. He had been convicted of armed robbery, aggravated assault, and manslaughter, and had only recently been released from prison. The officer investigating Fathead believed he had murdered his robbery partner 8 months earlier. He had been searching for him for months without success. Although investigators now knew more about Fathead, they still could not determine where he was hiding. They next turned to the woman whose voicemail they had listened to and who had previously been questioned while they were searching for E. Detectives suspected this woman was not being truthful. 3 days later, she was summoned for another interrogation. It was time to confront her directly. When she appeared for questioning, she arrived with a lawyer. It was clear she understood the seriousness of her situation and the charges she might face, which explained her decision to bring legal counsel. This did not discourage the detectives. Their only hope was that she could guide them to Fathead and E, providing the missing pieces of the puzzle. The woman admitted to officers that she had known Andre before he went to prison in 1990, which was the first question they asked her. Because of that, she claimed she had not spoken to him since then. She had not spoken to him much after his release from prison. Yet this renewed connection with Andre was turning into a terrible nightmare for her. According to police, the woman said Andre phoned her on the night of the abduction and asked to meet up. Eventually, she agreed. To her shock, Fathead appeared with him. She then explained that Andre and Fathead drove the van to Calvin's house, Geronta's father, and parked outside, waiting for the family to arrive. As soon as they did, Andre and Fathead carried out the plan. The woman recounted to investigators that Andre and Fathead handcuffed Brianna and Geronta, dragged them across the street, and forced them into the van. They compelled her to participate in the scheme, even though she had no prior knowledge of it. When she saw how helpless Brianna and Geronta were, she tried to console them, but she already understood what was going to happen. They drove the van to an apartment complex and telephoned Calvin to demand money for the safe return of Geronta and Brianna. Fat had abruptly ended the call in anger. He had just discovered that Calvin had notified police about the crime. Furious, Fathead jumped into the van with Brianna and Geronta and drove to a dark, secluded street. Another car, carrying Andre and the woman, followed behind. Fathead then ordered the woman to leave, so she drove off, but Andre remained at the scene. And with that, the complete picture of what had occurred that horrific night became clear. Investigators finally knew the entire truth. Still, one final question lingered. What exactly did he do, and where was he hiding? Detectives were utterly stunned when they uncovered the answer. They had been circling endlessly in their search for E the entire time. But in the end, E was nothing more than an illusion. E was simply a persona invented by Andre, a smokescreen meant to mislead investigators and prevent them from uncovering the truth. After the woman's confession, police possessed all the evidence required to arrest Andre and Fathead, yet they still needed proof placing them at the crime scene. Cell tower analysis of Andre's phone records confirmed that he had been present at the crime scene on August 1st. With this, officers finally had everything necessary to send Andre to prison. 3 days later, they brought him back in for another round of interrogation. Maintaining a composed demeanor, Andre tried to appear unconcerned. In addition, he flatly denied that the incriminating voicemails were his responsibility. Andre remained convinced that he could escape unscathed, deluded by his own fantasies. Detectives, however, now turned their focus toward Fathead, since Andre was already in custody. The very next day, Fathead was brought back to Atlanta for questioning. Investigators expected him to deny involvement and fabricate stories, but instead, Fathead admitted from the outset that he had killed Brianna and Geronta by shooting them. He confessed this with a cold, expressionless face. He explained that he had done it because he believed Calvin, Geronta's father, had large sums of money hidden in his house. For months, he and his associates had been following Calvin, gathering information about him and his family. He stated that he and Andre seized Geronta and Brianna, then began pounding on the door in an attempt to take control. When no one answered, they forcibly removed Brianna and Geronta instead. Detectives were stunned by how casually Fathead described the murders. He appeared to feel no remorse for his crimes. Although Fathead delivered a full confession before leaving the interrogation room, there was still a heavy sense of unease. At trial, both men admitted to 2 counts of murder and were sentenced to life imprisonment. The woman who had accompanied Andre and Fathead was not charged with any crime. Geronta and Brianna's daughter, Kaylee Brown, was raised by her grandmother, Sadria, Brianna's mother. Kaylee continued to feel her mother's presence in her life despite Brianna's death, as Sadria gave her all the love Brianna would have provided. Before closing, we extend our deepest sympathies to the families of Brianna Brooks and Geronta Brown. Dennis and Brenda Bowman were a married couple with 2 children from Holland, Michigan in 1989. They lived on the corner of Lincoln Road and 52nd Street. Dennis worked as a wood machinist and Brenda used to work at the jewelry counter at the Meyer department store. Their 2 children were Andrea and Vanessa Bowman. Andrea was born on June 23 of 1974 as Alexis Badger. Her biological parents are Kathy Turkanian and Randy Badger. Before her first birthday, she was adopted by Dennis and Brenda Bowman and renamed. Vanessa was born in January of 1988. Andrea went from being an only child to more than a big sister. She was a third parent to the chubby red-headed baby. While other kids her age went to after-school clubs and Friday night football games, Andrea stayed home changing diapers and cleaning bottles. On March 11th of 1989, Dennis Bowman contacted police. He told them that he had come home from his job to find 14-year-old Andrea missing. Dennis said that some of Andrea's belongings along with $100 from his dresser was also missing. He told police that Andrea was a troubled teenager who frequently fought with her mother and had run away to a friend's house once before. With no foul play suspected, The police labeled Andrea a runaway and passed her case along to the Youth Services Bureau. Few people who knew the Bowmans questioned the official narrative. Over the years, there had been whispers about the family. Once, when Andrea was in middle school, she boarded the school bus bleeding from her wrist. Some kids gossiped that she attempted to take her own life, but others said Andrea had cut herself trying to get back into her house after her parents locked her out. There were rumors that Dennis, a former Navy reservist with reddish-brown hair, a goatee and wire-rimmed glasses, and Brenda, a portly woman with curled bangs, abused Andrea. But back then, what happened behind closed doors was considered family business. Many people in Holland assumed that Andrea had gotten so fed up with her home that she finally split. Maybe she'd gone looking for her birth mother. People heard that she'd hitched a ride to a local truck stop and had left town with an older boy or was pregnant. Brenda reported a series of tips in the weeks and months following her daughter's disappearance, all of which seemed to confirm that Andrea had run away. A single photograph formed most people's memory of her. It was given to the police when she first vanished. In it, Andrea is sitting against a blue studio backdrop and looking just off camera, with her green eyes cast upward. Photos of missing children were often printed on the sides of milk cartons or on flyers taped to the top of pizza delivery boxes. Andrea's picture wound up somewhere else. In 1993, the band Soul Asylum debuted a music video for its song Runaway Train, featuring the images and names of missing kids across America. The video was a huge hit with several versions airing on MTV and VH1. In the one that played in Michigan, Andrea's photo appears just after the 2-minute mark. Reflecting on the video 20 years after its release, director Tony Kaye claimed that more than 24 missing children were found because of the video. Unfortunately, Andrea Bowman wasn't one of them, and her case went cold. The next major update in Andrea's case would come in 2010 when Carl Koppelman stepped in. Carl took an interest in true crime, which led him to Web Sleuths. It is a forum where crime hobbyists and armchair detectives connect and collaborate on unsolved cases. Spent countless hours scrolling through the national database of missing persons and unidentified bodies known as NAMAs. There is an overlap between the two main parts of the database, the disappeared and the deceased. Carl tried to match the characteristics of people who had gone missing with those of unidentified remains found. When Carl noticed that the age and condition of some of the bodies might make it difficult for loved ones to recognize them, it sparked an idea. He started creating lifelike renderings of Jane and John Does based on photos taken post-mortem. Some of the solved cases that we've covered on this channel before have been solved because of these renderings. Once he finished a rendering, Carl sent it to NAMUs, and the database would sometimes publish it. He also posted his work on Web Sleuths so other armchair detectives could use it in their identification efforts. Eventually, Carl began working with police departments and the DNA Doe Project, which identifies human remains through genetic testing and genealogical research. Carl got interested in the case of the Racine County Jane Doe. She was found near the edge of a Wisconsin cornfield in 1999. She had been not alive for about 12 hours, but rain washed away any evidence that might have been useful to investigators. It seemed likely that the young woman's life was taken elsewhere and dumped. An autopsy determined that she may have been cognitively disabled, and that she had suffered long-term abuse and neglect. She had broken bones and a cauliflower ear, and her body showed signs that she was assaulted. More than 50 people from the farming community where she was found attended her funeral. She was found wearing a men's gray and silver Western-style shirt embroidered with red flowers. On NAMAS, Carl plugged in some general search criteria, gender, age, location, and clicked through the results for missing persons. In most cases, the answer was a clear no. The age didn't match or the location made no sense. But one entry gave Carl hope: Andrea Bowman. Andrea and the Racine County Jane Doe shared physical characteristics and their ages aligned. Andrea would have been 25 in 1999 when the Jane Doe's life was taken. Holland, where Andrea disappeared, sits directly across Lake Michigan from where the Jane Doe was found. It's just 4 hours by car from one location to the other. Carl took his theory to law enforcement, who found it compelling enough to actually investigate. To determine whether the Jane Doe was Andrea, Police would need to compare DNA from the body with that of someone in Andrea's family. Because Andrea was adopted, authorities had to track down her birth mother, which took a while. Andrea's birth mother is Kathy Turkanian. In 1972, at the age of 14, she ran away from her family. Kathy left Virginia, where they lived, and hitchhiked to Memphis, Tennessee, and she had no money. Kathy met 19-year-old Randy Badger. In December of 1972, Kathy and Randy traveled to South Carolina, where it was legal for a minor to get married if they had parental permission. Kathy's parents gave it gladly because they did not want to be responsible for her at all. The couple were married less than a year when Kathy found out she was pregnant. On June 23rd of 1974, Kathy gave birth to a healthy daughter. She named her Alexis. When Alexis was 5 months old, Kathy and Randy separated, and she went back to live with her parents in Virginia. Kathy realized she was going to receive no help from her family and couldn't give Alexis the life that she wanted to. Alexis was put up for adoption and was soon adopted by Dennis and Brenda Bowman. In April of 2010, police working on Andrea's case sent a letter to Kathy Turkanian's home. The letter explained that Andrea disappeared from her adoptive home and that she might be a Jane Doe found in Wisconsin. Police needed a sample of Kathy's DNA to know for sure. Kathy was willing to share her DNA, but she wanted to know more about what had happened to her daughter. In the letter, it gave no details, and Kathy didn't even know that her name was changed to Andrea Bowman. She searched online for information about missing girls in Michigan. It didn't take long to find one from the town of Holland whose birthday and physical description matched Alexis's. When she saw the girl's school photo, Kathy thought Andrea Bowman could be her daughter. In her quest to find out more about Andrea, she connected with Carl Koppelman. While waiting for the DNA test results, Kathy also got in touch with a retired Michigan detective named Pat O'Reilly. Pat told Kathy that Andrea's adoptive father, Dennis Bowman, was responsible for her disappearance. Let's take a deeper look at Dennis and other crimes he committed. In May of 1980, a 19-year-old woman was riding her bike north of Holland, Michigan, when a motorcyclist forced her off the road. The man told her to get off her bike and walk into the woods. The young woman didn't move. The man pulled out a gun, fired a shot past her, and repeated the order. Still, she didn't budge. The man fired the gun again, this time at the ground near her feet. He said he would shoot her next. Just then, a car drove by and the motorcyclist turned his head towards the noise, and the young woman took the opportunity to pedal away as fast as she could. The man didn't shoot or give chase, and she was able to flag down someone in a pickup truck who drove her home. Her parents called the police, and the young woman provided a description of the suspect. A white male with tinted glasses and a blue helmet. His motorcycle, she said, had a blacktop case mounted on the back. By the end of the day, the police had detained a suspect. The young woman took one look at him and confirmed that he was the man who tried to attack her. It was Dennis Bowman, who by then was already a husband and a father. At the time, Andrea was almost 6 years old. Dennis was convicted of assault with intent to commit criminal conduct and sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. He was referred for psychological counseling, and a judge determined that he would likely pose a danger to women if he was free. Still, Dennis served the minimum sentence. One day in 1998, a state trooper in Dorr, Michigan responded to an alarm at the mobile home of 28-year-old Vicki Vandenbrink. She'd reported so many break-ins that the sheriff's department had installed a security system. When the trooper arrived at the scene, he found Dennis Bowman walking away from the back door. The Bowmans had moved to Hamilton, a town nestled between Holland and Dorr, in 1989, shortly after Andrea's disappearance. Dennis told the officer he was temporarily staying with Vicki Vandenbrink, who was a former co-worker of his. He was let go, but when authorities got in touch with Vicki, who wasn't home when the alarm went off, she said Dennis was lying. Dennis then changed his story, telling law enforcement that he'd entered the trailer to use the bathroom. He'd been there at least once before, he claimed, when his daughter Vanessa wanted to sell Girl Scout cookies to Vicki. Skeptical, the police obtained Dennis permission to search his property. In the loft of an outbuilding, they found a black duffel bag containing lingerie that was later identified as Vicki Vandenbrink's, as well as a short-barreled shotgun, a black sweatshirt, and a mask. Kathy Turkanian learned the details of Dennis Bowman's criminal record after submitting a Freedom of Information Act request based on what Detective Pat O'Reilly had told her. After seeing what he did to other women, Kathy became convinced that Dennis Bowman took Andrea's life. If Kathy was right, it would mean that the Racine County Jane Doe wasn't Andrea. That theory made sense only if Andrea was still alive 10 years after she disappeared. In 2013, the long-awaited DNA results confirmed it. Kathy was not related to the Jane Doe. In September of 2013, Kathy and Carl met in person at the Missing in Michigan conference. Organized by the state police, the conference was designed to raise awareness about and hopefully generate leads for cold cases. Kathy and Carl showed up in custom shirts they made that read, "Find Andrea Bowman." Carl scanned the room and was surprised when his eyes landed on familiar faces. He nudged Kathy and she looked over. "That's Vanessa," she said. "And that's Brenda." Brenda recognized Kathy because she saw that Kathy said on Facebook that she believes Dennis is responsible. Brenda seemed eager to explain her side of the story. She insisted that she and Dennis had fully cooperated with police after Andrea's disappearance. She presented a binder full of notes and missing persons flyers as proof. She recounted sightings of Andrea. It was clear she still believed that the teenager had run away. According to Carl, when he brought up Dennis' criminal record, Brenda replied, "Haven't forgotten what he did, but I do forgive him. I take my marriage vows very seriously." After the conference, Kathy hired a private investigator named Jeffrey Floor. He managed to get his hands on Andrea's police file, which Kathy and Carl had never seen. Oddly, the earliest documents in it were from March of 1989 when Andrea disappeared. They were dated 4 months earlier. That was when police responded to allegations of abuse in the Bowman home. The report did not go into detail about what happened, noting only that local authorities had determined that the allegations were not true. Carl and Kathy were sure that law enforcement had missed something. In 2017, Kathy and Carl met up with Chris Haverdink, the detective who'd taken over Andrea's case. Haverdink agreed that Bowman was suspicious, but that wasn't enough to arrest him. On November 22nd of 2019, Dennis Bowman was arrested by the Allegan County Sheriff's Office, but not because of anything to do with Andrea. He'd been arrested in relation to a crime committed 9 years before Andrea disappeared, more than 800 miles away from the shores of Lake Michigan. Bowman was arrested because he apparently took the life of Kathleen Doyle in 1980. 25-year-old Kathleen had been stripped gagged, strangled with an electrical cord, then assaulted and stabbed. Investigators collected male DNA from her body, but had few leads until Henry Lee Lucas was arrested in 1983. Lucas claimed that he and a partner named Otis Toole were responsible. His confessions were later revealed to be false and the charges were dropped. Eventually, science caught up with the case. Genetic genealogy, which compares unidentified DNA with a huge number of samples stored in databases, was becoming a very popular way of investigating these cold cases. Norfolk investigators partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a leader in the field, to test the DNA collected at Kathleen's crime scene. Soon, based on genealogical research, they had a list of more than 30 suspects. In 2019, after some more testing and police work, it led investigators to Dennis Bowman. Bowman was extradited to Virginia to stand trial. By then, he had already confessed. He admitted to entering Kathleen Doyle's home through a back window. He claimed that he was drunk and that it was an attempted robbery. He said he didn't expect to find Kathleen in the house and that he didn't plan to take her life. But she was in the house and he did take her life. At the time, Bowman was in Norfolk for his annual 2-week service in the Navy Reserve. He was also out of jail on bond. He was awaiting trial for the attempted assault of the 19-year-old Holland woman, the one he fired a gun at before she escaped on her bike. Kathy learned that she'd inadvertently played a role in solving Kathleen Doyle's case. Jeffrey Floor, a private detective, told her that at some point the Bowmans had visited the Allegan County Sheriff's Office to report Kathy for harassment. They claimed she was making defamatory accusations about Dennis online. Investigators offered Dennis a bottle of water and kept it when he left. According to Floor, that was how his DNA came into their possession. In the first week of February of 2020, with a thick layer of snow blanketing the ground, police returned to the Bowman's property. There was a forensics team on site this time with a crime scene tent and dogs in the backyard. Officials appeared to be concentrating on one area in particular, and they had started to dig. Later that day, the police held a press conference. They announced that human skeletal remains had been found and that they likely belonged to Andrea Bowman. The police needed to confirm that it was in fact Andrea. Kathy provided her DNA immediately. In March of 2020, almost 31 years to the day after Andrea disappeared, the results came back. There was a DNA match. Dennis claimed that what happened to Andrea was an accident. He said that they were arguing and he slapped her, causing her to fall and break her neck. He reported her missing to cover it up. That was the story that he told Brenda in correspondence from prison. In June of 2020, Dennis received 2 life sentences plus 20 years for taking the life of Kathleen Doyle. He was legally ordered to serve his time in Michigan, where he would stand trial for what he did to Andrea. The first hearing was held in February of 2021. Brenda took the stand first. She tearfully recounted how she'd made missing persons posters because she really believed that Andrea had run away. She said she learned the truth only after Dennis was arrested in the Kathleen Doyle case. When she was asked whether Andrea had ever accused Dennis of abusing her, Brenda said yes, but that she didn't believe the allegations were true. That's a lie, she told Andrea, and you know it. It was Brenda who told police where to find Andrea's remains. In a call from prison, Dennis had confessed to burying their daughter in the backyard. Brenda said she didn't believe him at first. They hadn't lived in their house in Hamilton when Andrea's life was taken, so how could he have buried her there? To Brenda's horror, Dennis explained that he'd moved their daughter's body to the new property as soon as they signed papers for it. The cement slab in the yard was the headstone of a grave that Brenda never even knew was there, in the shadow of the house she and Dennis shared for nearly 30 years. He didn't lie this time, Brenda told the detective when Andrea's remains were found. He didn't lie. As other witnesses took the stand, Dennis sat quietly in a green shirt, bow tie, and face mask. On December 22, 2021, Bowman pleaded no contest. He was sentenced to an additional 35 to 50 years in prison for taking Andrea Bowman's life. Bowman confessed to an assault from 1979. The crime was featured on the front page in the Holland Sentinel, published October 18, 1979. The article detailed a very violent attack on a 27-year-old woman who early on a Sunday morning was bound, gagged, and assaulted by an intruder in her home. The perpetrator took cash before fleeing the scene and was described as a white man between 25 and 30 years old with sandy hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He was estimated at 5 feet 6 inches, 150 pounds, and according to the young woman, her assailant was wearing a leather jacket and dark pants. The newspaper published a police sketch of the suspect, his ink-blotted pupils staring blankly from the front page. According to the lead detective in the case, there had been a recent uptick in reports of prowlers in the neighborhood where the crime had occurred. Police suspected that the attacker might have committed other crimes. This potentially means that there are a lot more cases that could be tied to Bowman. For those wondering, the Racine County Jane Doe was later identified as Peggy Johnson. Peggy was never reported missing. She was last seen at a homecoming dance in Harvard, Illinois in 1994. Most people who knew her assumed that she had just run away. An aunt worried enough to take out a classified ad in the paper. But nobody seemed to suspect that something terrible might have happened to the auburn-haired girl. Peggy disappeared shortly after her mother passed away, the sole parent in her low-income household. The 19-year-old found herself orphaned and homeless with a developmental disability that made it difficult for her to get a job. By chance, she met a nurse named Linda LaRoche who offered her work as a live-in housekeeper and nanny to her children. The teenager jumped at the opportunity. But over the next 5 years, LaRoche abused Peggy Johnson, beating her, starving her, and forcing her to live in a crawlspace. The violence culminated in 1999 when LaRoche allegedly ended 23-year-old Peggy's life and dumped her body in Raymond, Washington. No one could identify her, so she became known by the place where she was found, the Racine County Jane Doe. 20 years after Peggy's life was taken, Wisconsin police received a tip from a concerned citizen about a nurse who confessed to taking someone's life who worked for her in the late 1990s. In early November of 2019, Racine County authorities announced both Peggy's identity and LaRoche's arrest. In May of 2022, a judge in Racine County sentenced Linda LaRoche to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was also given an additional 5-year sentence for hiding Peggy's body. Peggy's step-aunt, Jenny Schroeder, had this to say to LaRoche: "I hope you have a slow, miserable time in your cage.